In 1994, a team of wildlife officers in northern Norway made a decision that seemed impossible. They were going to bring wild reindeer back to a frozen plateau called Hardangervidda, a place where the herds had been decimated, where the land had been silent for decades, where grazing had stopped, and the ecosystem had begun to collapse in ways no one had predicted. They released small breeding groups across the plateau. Then they stepped back. By 2014, 20 years later, the reindeer population had exploded to over 8,000 animals, the largest wild mountain reindeer herd in Europe. But that wasn't the story. The story was what happened to everything else. The plants that had overgrown the tundra for 50 years began to vanish. Rare lichen species that scientists thought were extinct started reappearing. Predators returned. The soil chemistry changed. Water flow patterns shifted. And then researchers discovered something in the permafrost that no one had been looking for. Something that had been locked beneath the surface since before the herds disappeared. Something the reindeer had accidentally released. This is what 20 years of wild reindeer did to one of the coldest, most isolated ecosystems in Europe, and why what happened there is now being studied by climate researchers across 6 countries. Hardangervidda is not like other places in Norway. It's a high plateau that stretches across 3,400 square miles of frozen tundra. Windswept, barren in winter, one of the largest mountain plateaus in Europe, and for most of the 20th century it was dying. Not in the way forests die, but in the way ecosystems unravel when a single piece is removed. In the 1940s and 50s, hunting pressure had reduced the wild reindeer population to fewer than 100 animals. Some years, scientists recorded only 30 individuals across the entire plateau. The herds that had grazed there for thousands of years were nearly gone, and without them, the land began to change. Thick mats of moss and shrub took over. Dwarf birch spread unchecked. The open tundra that had existed for millennia started closing in. Lichen, the primary food source for reindeer, was being smothered. By the 1980s, ecologists realized they were watching something irreversible, a landscape locking itself into a new state, one that couldn't support the species it had evolved with. So in 1994, the Norwegian government authorized a reintroduction program. Small groups of wild reindeer were released in carefully chosen areas. No fences, no management. Just animals and land. For the first 5 years, nothing seemed to happen. Population growth was slow. Some groups didn't survive. But then, around the year 2000, something shifted. The herds began to multiply faster than anyone had projected. And the land started responding in ways the scientists hadn't predicted. By 2005, the reindeer population had reached 3,000. By 2010, it was over 6,000. By 2014, more than 8,000 animals were roaming Hardangervidda, the largest wild mountain reindeer herd in Europe. They were eating everything. The thick moss beds that had dominated for decades were being trampled and grazed down to bare ground. The dwarf birch that had spread unchecked was being browsed back. The landscape was opening up again. Ecologists from the Norwegian Institute for Nature Research began conducting surveys. What they found shocked them. Lichen species that hadn't been recorded on the plateau since the 1950s were reappearing. Rare alpine plants were sprouting in areas that had been covered in moss for half a century. The soil itself was changing. Where the reindeer grazed heavily, the ground was more compact. Where they migrated, trails formed that channeled meltwater in new directions. The entire hydrology of the plateau was shifting. But then, in 2011, a researcher named Henrik Johansson noticed something strange. He was studying soil samples near one of the heaviest grazing zones, and he found microbial activity that didn't make sense. Bacteria that shouldn't have been active in frozen ground. Organic carbon levels that were rising, not falling. It was as if something beneath the surface had woken up. Johansson expanded his sampling area. He took cores from across the plateau, and in nearly every site where reindeer had been grazing intensively for more than a decade, he found the same thing. The permafrost wasn't just thawing, it was releasing something that had been locked in the ice for thousands of years. And the reindeer were the ones bringing it back to life. Johansson's findings were published in 2013, and they caught the attention of climate scientists across Scandinavia, because what he had discovered wasn't just unusual. It was a feedback loop no one had predicted. The reindeer weren't just grazing, they were compacting the snow. Every winter, thousands of hooves trampled the snowpack down, made it denser, harder, and that changed everything. Compact snow insulates less. It lets the cold penetrate deeper into the ground. In areas with heavy reindeer activity, the permafrost was actually staying colder, while across the rest of the Arctic, permafrost was thawing at alarming rates. Hardangervidda's frozen ground was stabilizing. The reindeer were protecting it. But that wasn't all. In the summer, the herds were stripping away the insulating layer of moss and shrubs, exposing bare ground. And bare ground reflects less heat. It cools faster at night. The combination was keeping the permafrost intact in ways that stunned researchers. A 2015 study compared soil temperatures in grazed versus ungrazed areas. The difference was nearly 2 degrees Celsius, enough to prevent widespread thaw, enough to keep the carbon locked in the ground. But then, in 2016, a team from the University of Oslo made a different discovery, one that changed the entire narrative. They were analyzing ancient pollen samples from the permafrost cores, layers of frozen organic material that dated back over 4,000 years. And buried in those layers, they found evidence of something that shouldn't have been there. Seeds. Thousands of them. From plant species that hadn't existed on Hardangervidda in millennia. Species that had vanished when the climate warmed after the last ice age. And now, in the trampled, disturbed soil where the reindeer grazed, some of those seeds were germinating. The botanists couldn't believe what they were seeing. Plants that had been extinct on the plateau for over 4,000 years were sprouting. Arctic poppies, glacial buttercups, species that existed during the last remnants of the ice age. Their seeds had been preserved in the permafrost, waiting. And when the reindeer trampled the ground, churned the soil, and exposed those ancient layers, the seeds found light again. By 2018, researchers had documented over a dozen Ice Age plant species re-emerging across Hardangervidda, small clusters at first, then entire patches. It was like watching the past come back to life. But it wasn't just plants. Predators had returned too. Golden eagles, which had abandoned the plateau in the 1960s, were nesting again. Wolverines were spotted for the first time in decades. Arctic foxes, nearly extinct in southern Norway, were denning in the rocky outcrops. The reindeer had brought back the food web, and the ecosystem was reassembling itself, piece by piece. But in 2019, something unexpected happened. The winter was unusually warm. Rain fell in January instead of snow. It froze into a thick ice layer over the ground. The reindeer couldn't break through it to reach the lichen below. Within weeks, hundreds of animals were starving. By spring, over 2,000 reindeer had died. The largest mass die-off in modern Norwegian history. Carcasses were scattered across the plateau, and wildlife managers faced a terrible question. Had they brought back too many? Had the herd grown beyond what the land could support? Or was this something else entirely? Because when researchers examined the dead reindeer, they found something in their tissue samples. Something that suggested the die-off wasn't just about ice and starvation. It was about what the animals had been eating for the past 20 years. The tissue analysis came back in late 2019, and it revealed something no one had considered. The reindeer that died weren't just starving. They were nutrient depleted. Specifically, they were lacking selenium and other trace minerals. Minerals that should have been abundant in the lichen they'd been eating for 20 years. But the lichen had changed. As the reindeer population exploded, grazing pressure increased. The The slow-growing lichen didn't have time to recover between feeding cycles. It was being eaten faster than it could absorb nutrients from the soil. The herd had grown so large that it was consuming a degraded food source. And when the ice layer hit, the animals were already weakened. The die-off wasn't a failure, it was a correction. Nature resetting the balance. By 2021, the herd had stabilized at around 6,000 animals. The ecosystem had found its equilibrium. The permafrost remained protected. The Ice Age plants continued to spread. Predators thrived. And researchers from across Europe were now studying Hardangervidda as a model. A living experiment in what happens when you let large herbivores reshape a landscape. Not in 5 years, but in 20. Not with management plans, but with patience. What started as a desperate attempt to save a dying plateau had revealed something far bigger. That ecosystems don't just recover, they evolve. They resurrect pieces of the past. They correct themselves. And sometimes all they need is the right animal in the right place doing what it was meant to do for thousands of years. Hardangervidda is still changing, still revealing secrets buried in the ice. And the reindeer are still there, walking across frozen ground that remembers them. If you want to see more stories like this, stories about nature doing the impossible when we step back and let it, hit subscribe, because this is just the beginning.